Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Devisha. I am a faculty at Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today we are going to cover Sustainable Livelihood Framework under the paper Environment and Society. Today we will be covering the introduction on sustainable livelihoods, key features that are part of Sustainable Livelihood Framework, and Sustainable Livelihood Framework per se would be explained in detail. So the Sustainable Livelihood Framework, the livelihood framework basically is a way of looking at the complexity of people's livelihoods, especially the livelihoods of the poor. It seeks to understand the various dimensions of a person's livelihood, the strategies, the objectives pursued, and associated opportunities and constraints. So the DFID, which is the Department for International Development in UK, propagated a framework. This is basically a tool for better understanding of livelihoods, particularly the livelihoods of the poor. The Sustainable Livelihoods Framework basically takes an integrated approach to poverty than just a narrow set of indicators such as income and productivity. So according to Ellis in 2000, basically he defines it. Livelihood comprises the assets, which includes natural, physical, human, financial and social capital, the activities and the access to these assets basically that together determine the living gained by the individual or households. Basically here when I talk about access to these assets, it is mediated by institutions and social relations. In particular, the framework provides a checklist of important issues and sketches out the way these link to each other. Now, it also draws attention to core influences and processes and emphasizes the multiple interactions between the various factors which affect livelihoods. Now, there are key features that we, when we talk about sustainable livelihood, there are some few key features now which I would be explaining. According to Salisbury in 2003, the Sustainable Livelihood Framework presents the key factors that influence people's livelihood decisions, outcomes and relations between these. It is used for planning new development activities and assessing the contribution to livelihood sustainability made by development intervention. It provides a checklist of important issues and emphasizes the multiple interactions between the various factors which affect livelihoods and is centered on people. Its aim is to help stakeholders with different perspectives to engage in structured and coherent debate about the many factors that affect livelihoods. The framework is meant to be a tool that can be used in planning and management with modifications. So it also provides a way of thinking about livelihoods that helps to understand the complexity and list diverse factors that affect livelihoods. So in order to get the most from the framework, the analysis could be conducted in a participatory manner, with a serious commitment to poverty elimination, and persons conducting it should be aware of social political factors that can skew answers towards the interest of the rich rather than the poor. So now we'll come to what is Sustainable Livelihood Framework per se. This shall be explained in detail. So when you take a look at the framework, there are various boxes that you see, various concepts that you see. Now, first box is the vulnerability context, which includes shocks, trends and seasonality. Then comes the livelihood assets, which includes various assets like a natural asset, financial asset, physical asset, etc., which influences the transforming structures and processes, which is structures and processes include, it could be levels of government or private sector, or processes would include laws, policies, culture, institution, etc. This along with that, the livelihood strategies along with all these, access to assets and the transforming structures and processes basically becomes the livelihood outcome. Each of these steps would be explained in detail now. Let's take the vulnerability context per se. So the vulnerability context as defined by the framework frames the external environment in which household exists. People's livelihoods are fundamentally affected by critical trends as well as shocks and seasonality, over which they have limited or no control. Now trends such as changes in population size, trends in natural or human resources, national and international policies, changing trends in governance, growth or replacement of technological trends are important changes that influence livelihood decisions. Now trends can be positive. For example, economic indicators can move in favorable directions, diseases can be eradicated, etc. Now shocks. What are shocks? Shocks are sudden happenings over a short period of time, such as human health shocks or accidents, natural disasters such as earthquakes, economic shocks, conflicts or crop or livestock health shocks, etc. They can destroy assets. For example, loss of crop or loss of life. Now comes the part of seasonality. What is seasonality? Seasonality is a periodic change such as a fall of price in a certain season. For example, when there agriculture season followed by a season where there is no agriculture at all, there could be shortage of food grains per se. Seasonality of production is another periodic change. Economic opportunities for laborers, etc. are all part of periodic change. Seasonality of rainfall determines livelihood strategies of subsistence farmers in dry periods, for example. Now the use of the term vulnerability context draws attention to the fact that this complex of influences is directly or indirectly responsible for many of the hardships faced by the poor and vulnerable people around the world. Now if the trends move in the positive direction, some people are able to gain from it, but some are unable to benefit as they lack assets or access to these assets and strong institutions working in their favor. Now for example, if the demand for organic products in the world market increases, the marginal organic farmers cannot gain from it as they do not have necessary resources to market on large scale per se, because they have subsistence economy. Now the vulnerability context can be changed through modifying institutions, policies, etc. For example, increasing people's access to appropriate financial services, insurance is one way of reducing shocks. Now compensations for crop loss by the government helps reduce the severity of the shock. Now let's look at the livelihood assets. What we have covered right now is the vulnerability context. Now the second box or the second set of terms that we see in the framework, sustainable livelihood framework, is the livelihood asset. Now the livelihood approach seeks to gain an accurate and realistic understanding of people's strengths, that is assets or capital endowments, and how they attempt to convert these into positive livelihood outcomes. People need a range of assets to achieve positive livelihood outcomes. Poor people access to any given categories of assets tends to be very limited. It is seen that people find out ways of nurturing and combining what assets they do have in imaginative ways to ensure survival. So now here we can look at the livelihood pentagon, which includes the human capital, natural capital, social capital, physical capital and financial capital. So it lies at the core of the livelihood framework and depicts important interrelationship between various assets per se. Now various processes can affect assets basically. One aspect is the asset creation. Example, government policy to invest in roads, electricity as basic infrastructure, it's a physical capital, or skill or technology generation, it can yield human capital. Now many livelihood programs in India have helped create assets for the poor. Example, Indira Awas Yojana enables poor people to build houses. Another aspect is the access to assets. Example, legal ownership rights or community institutions regulating access to common resources. Being part of Joint Forest Management Committee give access to government forest resources for the tribals. Now the third aspect would be rates of asset accumulation. For example, policies that affect returns, interest on saving, taxation, etc. Now, poverty studies have shown that people's ability to escape from poverty is critically dependent upon their access to assets. Now, upon this, we'll be looking at each of the assets that I had mentioned earlier. The first one that we would discuss is on the human asset. Human capital includes the skills, knowledge, ability to labor, and good health that together make it possible for people to pursue different livelihood strategies and achieve their livelihood objectives. At a family level, human capital is the amount and nature of labor available. Schemes that support for skills, education, health, etc. can help building of human capital. Now, the next capital that we are going to talk about is the social capital. In the context of sustainable livelihoods framework, it is interpreted as the social resources upon which people draw in pursuit of their livelihood objectives. These are developed through networks and connectedness that increases people's trust and ability to work together and expand. For example, family and friends. Membership of more formalized organizations, which often entails adherence to mutually agreed or commonly accepted rules. For example, self-help groups, cooperatives, water users association, etc. Relationships of trust, reciprocity, or exchanges that facilitate cooperation, reduce transaction cost, and may provide the basis for informal safety nets amongst the poor, are also part of the social capital, which includes a caste group or even a village for that matter. So a wide example of this would be when people are already linked through common norms and sanctions, which is family, religion, caste, region, etc. They are more likely to form new groups to pursue their interest. Many trading communities have successfully developed trade relations based on family ties. The next aspect that we are going to talk about is the natural capital. Natural capital is the term used for the natural resources from which resource flows. Example, nutrient cycle, erosion protection, etc. And services that are useful for livelihoods are derived from this. There is a wide variation in resources that make up natural capital, from intangible public goods such as the atmosphere, biodiversity, etc. to divisible assets used directly for production, for example, trees, land, etc. Now, natural capital is especially important to those who derive all or part of their livelihood from direct use of resources. For example, farming, fishing, gathering in forests, mineral extraction, etc. Sustainability of livelihood can be dependent on sustainability of natural capital. The next capital asset that we are going to cover is the physical capital. Physical capital includes the basic infrastructure and producer goods needed to support livelihoods. Infrastructure means of changes to the physical environment that help people to meet their basic needs and to be more productive. Easily affordable transportation, safe shelter and buildings, enough water supply and sanitation, clean affordable energy sources and access to information, including communications, are usually essential for sustainable livelihoods. Infrastructure such as roads are commonly a public good that is used without direct payment. So the livelihood approach focuses on helping to provide access to appropriate infrastructure that entails poor people to achieve their livelihood objectives. Now, providing houses or loans for building houses for the poor is one way of achieving this. Infrastructure is only an asset as far as it facilitates improved service provision to enable poor to meet their needs. Another aspect that we are going to discuss here is about the financial capital. In the market economy, financial capital is probably the most versatile of the 5 categories of assets. It can be converted mostly with ease depending upon transforming structures and processes. That is, those are the basic things that we look into. Now, money can be used for direct achievement for livelihood outcomes. For example, when food is purchased to reduce food insecurity. However, it is also the asset that tends to be the least available to the poor, as in fact poverty is often defined using income criteria. There are assets or outcomes that may not be achieved through use of money alone, such as different components of well-being and knowledge of human rights. Now that is one aspect that might not be fully covered in this livelihood framework per se. So we have basically covered the vulnerability context here, the different livelihood assets. Now we will be going into the transforming structures and processes. Okay, so to sum up the sustainable livelihood framework, let's look at the sustainable livelihood framework as such, as a framework per se. I'm going to explain it once again, which is the first box that we have looked up is the vulnerability context, which includes shocks, trends and seasonalities. Shocks, trends and seasonalities are basically aspects that households face in a rural or urban background, where these shocks or trends or seasonalities that each of these example farmers face could actually contribute to the context of vulnerability that they face. And this often is influenced by the lack of livelihood assets, access to these assets, which includes the human capital, the natural capital, financial, social or physical. Here human capital could be labor, whether they have the health to basically go and work. Natural capital is where they have access to, say, a farmer has land or not. Maybe a laborer wants to take up land, but many times they don't have the land on their names. So they are not part of user associations. They are denied access to land, they are denied access to various user associations and other resource systems. So a lack of natural capital could be one aspect. Financial capital, often what happens is that we see that there's a cycle. When they sell the produce, they get the money. What happens when a drought hits or there is a flood in the region, and they do not get basically the financial capital to put back for farming or fishing or any other aspect that they want to look upon in future. Social capital would be basically the support system that they get from maybe families, could be from the religion, from the village, etc. Or even and also another aspect is the physical capital. So all these aspects per se, a lack of access to these resources leads poor households to more vulnerability basically. So the livelihood assets are extremely important, and this is something that the poor households have problem in terms of access, and most of the times they have one or two livelihood assets that they can access, and they basically see how each of these assets work in favor of the other and try and move their livelihood per se. Now this often is influences and also even assesses the various structures and processes that are intertwined in this process. It could include structures and processes. That is, one would be the level of government, levels of government could be the central government, state government, it could be the panchayat raj, etc. Now, for example, one thing that I have come across in the field is that farmers do not have laborers in the state of Kerala during the agricultural season. So the panchayat had initiated this factor that laborers who form under the Manrega system would be going to the farmlands to help out the farmers. So this is a perfect way in which a structure is helping out to basically lessen the vulnerability context of the poor. The farmers per se. But what has happened is that there is an order from the state government or from the central government that it cannot be done so. The program is for Manrega, and they have to deal with, say, maybe cleaning up of roads, or the Porambok land or the common land areas, etc. Now here the vulnerability context is only pushed upon the poor farmers or even the laborers for that matter. Another sector would be the private sector. The structures per se would be the private sector. which includes CBOs, NGOs, etc. Now, processes include institutions, policies, laws and culture that drive these entire structures per se. Now, all these could in fact help in accessing livelihood assets, or in fact it can influence not accessing the livelihood assets per se. Now, all this would help in, or would actually formulate the livelihood strategies per se, which becomes the livelihood outcome. Now, what are the livelihood outcomes? Now, livelihood outcome could be more income, it could be increased well-being, it could be reduced vulnerability, improved food security, more sustainable use of natural resource base, etc. could be a livelihood income. Now, if there is a proper strategized livelihood income that is coming through, then it would in fact add to the factor that they would be able to access assets more. Now, if that does not work, it adds to the vulnerability the context. The transforming structures and processes are a very important aspect in the sustainable livelihood framework. If this factor does not work properly, it will surely lead to more vulnerability context of the poor. Transforming structures and processes. Now, what is this per se? Now, the processes are established and implemented through structures, various structures. It could be governmental or non-governmental. Here, processes could be, example, policies. They can help reduce the impacts of external shocks, example, policy on drought relief and number of relief providing agencies for that matter. Many other types of processes are also included in this, and it's also very important. Well-functioning markets can help reduce the adverse effects of seasonality by facilitating inter-area trade. Now, some institutions can restrict or reduce people's choice of livelihood strategies. For example, in rigid caste system, social systems that prevent women from doing some activities. Now, another factor is that responsible political structures can implement pro-poor policies leading to better livelihoods. They can create rights, right to work, right to food, etc., or promote awareness of rights. So, one of the most important or common problem in development is that processes do not work in favor of the poor. This can be a deliberate outcome driven by a failure of prevailing or elite controlled governance arrangements, or it could be just accidental and the result of evolutionary process in which the poor have played little part. External support can help solve these problems through building structures for the poor. It is possible to make interventions for providing information to support a more pro-poor policy making processes. Now, deepening and strengthening the contact between the poor and policy makers is one aspect that can be looked upon. Increasing the accountability and transparency of public decision making. It's a main objective of decentralization of development work per se. That could be another aspect that can be looked upon. Another thing that can be looked upon is by providing support to local organizations to adopt pro-poor ways of operating. So, sustainable livelihood approach suggests that sector programs can address the needs. Sector programs define the appropriate role of the state and helping it to execute this role better. This improves the efficiency of public sector management. The livelihoods approach seeks to promote choice, opportunity and diversity for poor households. It also shows how important government mechanisms are when it comes to delivery of these programs throughout the country. For example, Manrega, or where the financial capital is accessible by the poor, work is able to reach them, is one aspect where Government of India has reached out to the poor of its country. The next aspect that we are going to talk about is the diversity and linkages. Now, recent studies have shown enormous diversity of livelihood strategies at every level, within geographical regions, across sectors, within households and even over time. Development efforts sought to improve the services and opportunities available to these categories of people. The sustainable livelihood approach, by contrast, seeks to develop an understanding of the factors that lie behind people's choice of livelihood strategy, and then to reinforce the positive aspects. So this increase of choice is important because it provides people with opportunities for self-determination and flexibility to adopt over time. It can be achieved by improving poor people's access to resources that help in livelihood strategies, and to create responsive structures and processes based on the needs of the people. Now, what are the outcomes based on these development indicators or indicator development? Now, the success of the livelihood interventions can be assessed by understanding their contribution to the achievement of livelihood outcomes that people consider important. Indicators that sustainability can be formulated with particular groups and monitoring processes can be made participatory. Rise in income, increased livestock, education to children are some of the easily monitored outcomes. Sustainable livelihood framework is used for research as well as actual intervention in many countries. Now, in the Indian context, the learning from these have helped develop livelihood programs such as National Rural Livelihood Mission by Ministry of Rural Development, National Urban Livelihood Mission by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation of Government of India, our mission for promoting livelihoods for poor in rural and urban areas. So today we have actually discussed on the DFID framework of sustainable livelihood, and this is a framework that is widely used in research and in many countries. I hope you have learned about this framework, and for more enhanced reading you should definitely visit the resources in EPG Pathshala. Thank you.